The geopolitical chessboard is under immense pressure. The waters near the island of Aruba, a critical choke point for maritime traffic, have become the epicenter of a crisis of strategic ambiguity. A coordinated naval force combining the operational might of the Russian and Chinese navies has not merely arrived in the Caribbean. It has executed a highly calculated maneuver designed to test the limits of the American-led economic blockade against Venezuela. The world is no longer speculating about a potential conflict. It is witnessing a direct, unified, and deeply consequential challenge to the United States' long-established dominance. This is the moment where the rhetoric of a multipolar world transforms into a tangible, armed reality, forcing a critical re-evaluation of global power dynamics. The flashpoint was not a military strike, but a meticulously orchestrated sovereignty transit operation. A massive, jointly escorted commercial convoy, carrying essential goods and oil equipment, deliberately crossed the U.S. declared exclusion zone. The Sino-Russian fleet, positioned as a deterrent force, created the strategic cover that allowed the commercial vessels to breach the blockade. This act, a calculated political and military provocation, has served as the ultimate catalyst, forcing the U.S. to choose between maintaining its blockade and risking an uncontrolled escalation with two nuclear powers. Intelligence reports from the U.S. Northern Command, NORTHCOM, now taking the lead in this theater, confirmed the deployment of a joint task force. This combined fleet includes the Russian guided missile cruiser Marshal Ustinov and the Chinese Type 055 super destroyer Dalian. This is not a symbolic visit. It is a battle-ready formation, explicitly tasked with escorting a massive convoy of tankers and cargo ships into the Venezuelan port of La Guaira, thereby shattering the U.S. blockade's credibility. In response, the U.S. has mobilized the Carrier Strike Group 2, led by the supercarrier USS George H.W. Bush, deploying from its home port in Norfolk, Virginia. The stakes are no longer about oil or democracy. They are about the credibility of the U.S. Navy and the survival of the Monroe Doctrine. This exhaustive script will dissect the intricate layers of this crisis, from the strategic calculus of Moscow and Beijing to the immediate, terrifying consequences on global markets and the very real countdown to a naval exchange. Prepare to understand why the combined fleets of Russia and China are risking a geopolitical rupture to defend Venezuela. Pause for a second. If you're already feeling the weight of this crisis, leave your opinion in the comments now. Do you think the U.S. should risk war to maintain the blockade? Your voice is the first line of defense against disinformation. The joint arrival of the Russian and Chinese naval forces, operating under a unified command structure, represents the most significant challenge to U.S. maritime authority since the Cold War. Their mission is simple, yet revolutionary: to escort a massive commercial convoy through the U.S. blockade line, effectively nullifying the sanctions regime through a show of force. The Sino-Russian naval composition, a new axis of power. Combined fleet is a masterful blend of Russian deep-sea experience and Chinese technological innovation, designed to counter the U.S. Carrier Strike Group. Russian contingent. The force is anchored by the Marshal Ustinov Slava-class cruiser, a powerful anti-ship missile platform, and the Admiral Grigorovich-class frigate Admiral Essen, known for its multi-role capabilities. The most profound strategic concern remains the presence of at least two Yasen-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs, operating covertly in the Atlantic. Their deployment signals the highest level of commitment from Moscow, transforming the crisis into a matter of strategic deterrence. Chinese contingent. The Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy plan contribution is led by the Type 055 super destroyer Dalian, a vessel with immense radar and missile capacity, capable of coordinating air defense for the entire task force. It is supported by the Type 901 fast combat support ship Hulunhu, which provides massive logistical support, showcasing Beijing's long-range expeditionary capability. This combined power is positioned near the Los Testigos Islands, a remote, disputed territory that provides an ideal staging area for their operation, placing them strategically between the U.S. fleet and the Venezuelan coast. The U.S. reaction was swift, but deeply constrained by the political reality of engaging two nuclear powers. The U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, has been augmented by assets from the Atlantic Fleet, forming the core of Carrier Strike Group 2. Carrier, the nuclear-powered supercarrier USS George H.W. Bush, with its full complement of FA-18 Super Hornets, is the centerpiece. Escort, the Ticonderoga-class cruiser USS Philippine Sea and the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers USS Truxtun and USS Farragut, form the defensive screen. Submarine, the Virginia-class fast attack submarine USS New Jersey is operating in the deep waters, tasked with tracking the Russian SSNs, a mission of terrifying consequence. The U.S. has established a clear maritime interdiction zone around the Venezuelan coast, declaring that any vessel attempting to breach the blockade will be intercepted. The Sino-Russian fleets advance toward the Gulf of Venezuela. Escorting the convoy is a direct, calculated move to force the U.S. to choose between escalating to a military confrontation or accepting the erosion of its sanctions policy. If you value analysis that uncovers the truth behind the headlines, now is the time. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this crisis. The Venezuelan government, now openly supported by the combined naval might, has shifted its narrative from mere survival to a powerful reaffirmation of national sovereignty and the right to free trade. Nicolas Maduro, speaking from the Miraflores Palace, declared the U.S. blockade an illegal act of economic warfare and hailed the Sino-Russian fleet as the pillars of the multipolar world. The core of this narrative is the breaking of the U.S. blockade, which Caracas and its allies frame as an illegal act of war against a sovereign nation. The success of this convoy is the de facto end of the U.S. blockade and a massive political victory for the anti-U.S. alliance. The joint deployment is not about a single shipment. It is a profound declaration that the era of uncontested U.S. global power is over. Russia and China are using the Venezuelan crisis as a deliberate, low-cost opportunity to rewrite the rules of international engagement, establishing a multipolar doctrine that directly counters the Monroe Doctrine. The core motivation is the establishment of a multipolar doctrine, a direct counterpoint to the Monroe Doctrine. Russia's calculus. Moscow views the challenge as a strategic diversion, forcing the U.S. to dedicate massive resources to its own backyard, thereby relieving pressure on Russia's primary theaters of operation in Europe and the Black Sea. Furthermore, it solidifies Russia's role as a global power capable of projecting force far beyond its borders. China's calculus. Beijing is focused on establishing the principle of freedom of commerce for all, directly challenging the U.S.'s ability to use economic sanctions as a weapon. The successful breach of the blockade would validate China's long-term strategy of building parallel economic and security structures outside the U.S.-led system. The blockade as the target, the U.S. blockade, designed to starve the Maduro regime of resources, has become the perfect casus belli for a non-military challenge. By framing their action as a defense of international law and the right of a sovereign nation to trade, Russia and China gain a significant moral and diplomatic advantage, forcing the U.S. to appear as the aggressor. The deployment is a massive live-fire test for both ships. The Chinese Dalian is testing its integrated air defense against the U.S. carrier air wing, while the Russian submarines are testing their stealth capabilities against the U.S. Navy's Advanced Anti-Submarine Warfare (ASW) systems. The Caribbean has become the world's most dangerous naval proving ground, where the slightest technical failure could trigger a global conflict. If this analysis made you think, show your support. Like and share this video with a friend who needs to understand the gravity of this crisis. This helps us get this critical information to more people. The crisis has triggered a global economic and diplomatic meltdown, with the world splitting into two distinct, armed camps. Energy market chaos. The price of crude oil has surged to an all-time high of $180 a barrel, driven by the fear that the conflict will spread to the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil supply. The fear is not just about Venezuelan oil, but about the security of all global energy routes. Diplomatic divide. The world is now formally divided. The Group of Seven, G7, has issued a strongly worded condemnation of the Sino-Russian provocation, while the BRICS Plus nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus new members, have issued a counterstatement supporting the right of Venezuela to self-determination and free commerce. The UN Security Council is a dead letter, paralyzed by the vetoes of Russia and China. Regional instability. The crisis has destabilized the entire Caribbean basin. Nations like Colombia and Guyana are mobilizing their forces, fearing that the conflict will spill over their borders. The entire region is now a high-risk zone with massive capital flight and a collapse of the tourism industry. The geopolitical implications are clear. The Sino-Russian alliance has successfully forced the US to fight a two-front war, one military, one diplomatic, in its own hemisphere. The success of the convoy will be seen globally as the moment the US lost control of its backyard. What would you do? Given the paralysis of the UN Security Council and the division of the G7 BRICS Plus, what diplomatic measure should the White House take now to defuse the crisis without losing credibility? Leave your tactical suggestion in the comments. The combined fleet's advance toward the Gulf of Venezuela creates a terrifying countdown. The US must act before the convoy reaches La Guaira. Scenario 1. The submarine engagement and the silent war. The US submarine New Jersey detects a Russian SSN. The US attempts to force the Russian sub to surface. The resulting confrontation deep underwater leads to a torpedo being fired. The sinking of a nuclear-powered submarine, American or Russian, is an act of war that leaves no room for de-escalation. The conflict immediately expands to include the strategic arsenals of all three nations. Scenario 2. The air intercept and the loss of a Super Hornet. US FA-18 Super Hornets from the George H.W. Bush are scrambled to intercept Chinese J-15 fighters launched from the Hulunhu support ship. In a high-speed, high-stakes maneuver, a Chinese fighter collides with a US jet. The loss of the US pilot is the casus belli the US needs to launch a retaliatory strike against the Chinese Hulunhu. The naval battle begins immediately. Scenario 3. The convoy breach and the point of no return. The Sino-Russian fleet escorting the convoy crosses the US-declared maritime interdiction zone. The US Navy fires a warning shot across the bow of the lead Russian cruiser. The Chinese Dalian immediately responds by targeting the US destroyer that fired the shot with an anti-ship missile. The conflict moves from a tense standoff to an active naval battle, with the US forced to fight a two-front war in its own backyard. Scenario 4. The cyber naval blindness. Russia and China launch a coordinated massive cyber attack against the Yuandai, US Navy's command and control systems, attempting to blind the US fleet and disrupt the Aegis combat system on the USS Philippine Sea. Simultaneously, the combined fleet launches a coordinated missile strike. The US, unable to effectively coordinate its defense, suffers catastrophic losses. The war moves beyond the naval theater, becoming a global digital conflict that cripples the economies and infrastructure of both nations. The Sino-Russian move introduces a new strategic concept: mutually assured economic disruption. The US cannot engage militarily without triggering a catastrophic response from both nations on the economic front. China holds trillions in US debt and is the world's largest manufacturer. Russia is a key energy supplier. A full-scale conflict would not only be military, but would involve a simultaneous coordinated economic attack that would instantly collapse the global financial system. This MAED doctrine is the true deterrent, forcing the US to hesitate even as its naval authority is being directly challenged. The economic fallout alone is a weapon more potent than any missile. While the immediate focus is on Venezuela, the true strategic prize is the Panama Canal. The successful establishment of a Sino-Russian naval presence in the Caribbean places them in a position to exert influence or even control over the canal's vital shipping lanes. This is the ultimate threat to US global trade and military logistics. The crisis in Venezuela is merely the opening move in a larger game to control the most critical maritime choke point in the Western Hemisphere. The US response is not just about Venezuela. It is about defending the integrity of the canal, a lifeline for global commerce. The most damaging consequence for the US is the silent defection of its traditional regional allies. Nations like Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, while not openly supporting the Sino-Russian action, have refused to condemn it, calling instead for dialogue and de-escalation. This diplomatic neutrality is a massive victory for the Sino-Russian alliance, as it isolates the U.S. and validates the narrative that Washington is the sole aggressor. The U.S. has lost the diplomatic battle for the hemisphere, forcing it to rely solely on military force, which is politically unsustainable. The failure of the Organization of American States, OAS, to issue a unified condemnation is the final nail in the coffin of U.S. diplomatic dominance in the region. The Sino-Russian operation is a masterclass in gray zone warfare. They have not fired the first shot, but they have forced the U.S. into a position where it must fire the first shot to maintain its blockade. This strategic ambiguity places all the legal and diplomatic burden on the U.S. The Sovereignty Transit Operation is the perfect example. The Sino-Russian fleet is present, but they are not the direct aggressors, allowing them to maintain the moral high ground while achieving their strategic objective. The U.S. must now fight a war where the enemy is constantly shifting between military and diplomatic action, a challenge for which the U.S. military doctrine is ill-prepared. The crisis in the Caribbean is not isolated. It is a strategic diversion designed to stretch U.S. military and diplomatic resources thin. By forcing the U.S. to dedicate a carrier strike group and top-tier intelligence assets to the Caribbean, Russia and China are simultaneously easing the pressure on their primary theaters of interest, Taiwan and Ukraine. The U.S. must now decide if the defense of the Monroe Doctrine is worth risking a major escalation in the Pacific or Eastern Europe. This strategic linkage transforms the Venezuelan crisis from a regional dispute into a global test of U.S. resolve and resource allocation. The world is watching to see which front the U.S. will choose to prioritize, and the decision will have profound, long-lasting consequences for the balance of power. The success of the Sino-Russian convoy establishes them as the de facto champions of the global South against what many nations perceive as Western economic coercion. This is a massive propaganda victory, as it provides a tangible example of a successful challenge to U.S. sanctions. This narrative will resonate deeply across Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Latin America, leading to a further erosion of U.S. influence and a strengthening of the BRICS Plus bloc. The political cost of the blockade has just become global. The cost of credibility, new section for 22K beer. The U.S. has always operated on the principle that its word is law, backed by the implicit threat of force. The Sino-Russian challenge is not just a naval maneuver, it is an attack on the very foundation of U.S. credibility. If the blockade is broken, the sanctions regime against Iran, North Korea, and other nations will be instantly undermined. Every nation under U.S. sanction will see the Venezuelan crisis as a blueprint for defiance. The cost of maintaining the blockade is the risk of a global war. The cost of allowing it to be broken is the collapse of the U.S.-led global economic order. This is the tightrope walk the White House is currently performing, and the slightest misstep will have irreversible consequences. The world has never been closer to a fundamental reordering of power, and the fate of the U.S. global standing hangs in the balance over a few miles of Caribbean water. Beyond the military and economic dimensions, this crisis is a battle for the global narrative. Russia and China are meticulously crafting a story of a David versus Goliath struggle, where they are the defenders of a sovereign nation against a bullying superpower. The U.S., by contrast, is struggling to articulate a coherent defense of its actions, often falling back on outdated rhetoric. The success of the Sino-Russian operation is a testament to their ability to win the information war, turning a military confrontation into a public relations disaster for Washington. This narrative victory is arguably more valuable than any tactical gain, as it accelerates the decline of U.S. soft power across the globe. The Sino-Russian operation is a masterclass in gray zone warfare. They have not fired the first shot, but they have forced the U.S. into a position where it must fire the first shot to maintain its blockade. This strategic ambiguity places all the legal and diplomatic burden on the U.S. The Sovereignty Transit Operation is the perfect example. The Sino-Russian fleet is present, but they are not the direct aggressors, allowing them to maintain the moral high ground while achieving their strategic objective. The US must now fight a war where the enemy is constantly shifting between military and diplomatic action, a challenge for which the US military doctrine is ill-prepared. This new reality of conflict, where the line between peace and war is deliberately blurred, is the most dangerous legacy of the Venezuelan crisis. If you want to know how the dollar's collapse could be the next weapon of war, click on the video now on your screen. It's the logical continuation of this crisis and the missing piece to understanding the full picture. The joint deployment of the Russian and Chinese ships is not just a challenge, it is a fundamental shift in the global balance of power. By successfully uniting their forces to challenge the US blockade of Venezuela, they have demonstrated that the era of US unilateralism is over. The world is now watching the Los Testigos Islands chain, waiting to see if the US will risk a global war to maintain a blockade that has already been politically defeated. The Caribbean is no longer a backyard. It is the new center of the world, where the rules of the 21st century are being written, the improved conclusion and the call to opinion. The central question is not if there will be a confrontation, but when and how it will manifest. The Cold War 2.0 scenario in the Caribbean is real, and the US decision to maintain or withdraw from the blockade will define the next decade of global geopolitics. Now we want to hear your opinion. Comment below. Which escalation scenario, submarine, aerial, convoy, cybernetic, do you consider most likely? Honest opinion. If you were the president of the USA, would you risk war to maintain the blockade, or would you accept political defeat to avoid conflict? Your opinion is the final piece of this puzzle. Don't keep it to yourself. Share it and let's continue this critical analysis together.